establishes evidence of our promissory obligations to each other presumes that interest is justified to it. Obviously, this is intended exploitation and crime against all of us, and they're probably the people at the top of this thing are dying laughing at our stupidity, that we don't realize this. But in any case, if there was ever once in history a justification of interest in this situation, it would have to justify that indeed the obligor should be paying the principal to the banks. The banks should keep it, although they only had a $2 cost of publishing our promissory obligation. They should keep the principal, and that even as no $100,000 of property of the banks was ever at stake, only $2 was at stake, and that's recouped typically in a tiny fraction of the first payment against any such debt. The $2 is guaranteed back, and it exists usually in equity, which relates to, say, a deposit in the case of a house, that you've got to come up with so much of the original, value of the house in principal, and you're loaned the rest, So there's property ensuring the banking system, which is a lie itself that it's just a banking system. It's a system of exploitation. But there's property that guarantees there's no way they're going to lose that $2. Much less does that $2 of expense and pretended role of being a creditor justify interest. So if ever in history existed a justification of interest for the issuance of paper money, it would have to invalidate all of these facts, or prove that somehow this $2 justified laundering the principal into the banking system's possession instead of paying it out of circulation, and even though that was never given up by the bank, charging interest against that, which was never given up by the bank, was never the bank's possession. You see,
sure, I think that certainly makes sense, and that's the thing behind the argument against fractional reserve banking. What I'm failing to understand is your position on
fractional reserve.
Yeah, on non-fractional reserve. So what is?
Oh no! I'm in full agreement that fractional reserve goes out the window. What I'm in the process of doing is explaining to you the wrongs of the two cases.
Okay.
That is, and then the fact that there's only one way to ever avoid that. You see.
Okay.
So there's only one implementation of all this, which in fact is going to return to the case that we've just explained. In truth, we can, out of what we've just explained about the nature of an actual promissory obligation, we can see that in fact, given the schedule of payment that I have just asserted so far, but approved in our previous arguments, how it maintains a one-to-one relationship between the volume of circulation and the remaining value of represented property. It's the only thing that's obligatory schedule of payment is in conjunction with an eradication of interest, is the only thing which maintains the integrity of our promissory obligations and our circulation. You see, so this is indispensable not only to the creditor but to every obligor. And from this example, we can extrapolate exactly, because it and it alone have all the balances which actually solve all of the categoric faults of a pretended economy. Maybe I should cover that first and then come back to this. How is mathematically perfected economy? And in fact, this case of a natural promissory obligation, how is it the one and one only solution of all the categoric faults of any purported economy? Well, let's give the categoric faults. The first I give is inflation, deflation, and maldisposition, which I've already explained. Circulatory, inflation, deflation, and maldisposition. The second I give is a very broad thing.
Can I just take a slight tangent there? We'll come back. You're doing the three things. But in the simplest of of terms, and as you as a mathematician, can you explain to me how anybody could, and we're talking, Friedman or, some of the most well-regarded economists in the world, how can anyone come to the conclusion that you can continually, year on year, run inflation? And isn't anything that continues year on year exponential as a guaranteed result?
That's another matter there. When you use the word inflation, I in my own work, terminology is very important. So anyone who analyzes these things realizes, for instance, when people are using inflation to imply that circulatory inflation causes price inflation, that those two things are two different things, and if in fact circulatory inflation is not a cause of price inflation, they have to be distinguished as two different things, the definitions of which confirm this separation of facts. That is, that price inflation, on the contrary of being a consequence of circulatory inflation, the only systemic cause of price inflation is in fact this artificial perpetual multiplication of artificial indebtedness, which forces industry to increase its prices in order to maintain margins of solubility, while at the same time maldisposition prevents industry from doing so to the degrees that it needs to, because there's just not that much circulation available to industry's markets, and which is another expression for why there's an ultimate failure of industry. So,
the inflation, the price inflation,
yes,
of course, factoring the interest that has to be repaid into prices.
Yes, but industry is never able to keep up with that to the degree that it needs to maintain vital margins of solubility, for which it will fail if it fails to maintain these. And the reason is because of maldisposition is dedicating ever more of the circulation to servicing the escalating sum of artificial debt. If industry could even tread water, its prices would have to go up at the rate of which is equivalent to the increasing rate of indebtedness. You see, and it doesn't even approach that. I mean, we can just look at the two graphs in our heads. Anybody that's even casually follow this for any while can go, whoa. In fact, if the Fed has reduced inflation, price inflation to 2% or under, which is its target for forever, in truth, all that means, as they accomplish that by increasing interest rates, is instead we're paying the costs that we would have paid in price inflation in interest on an escalating sum of debt to such a degree that industry can't increase its prices as it needs to remain soluble. So it's all the more ensuring failure of our industry, and it hasn't even relieved any cost to us. You see, which is just, I mean, I'm smiling ear to ear as I say that, because how stupid can we be, to think that we're better off for paying more interest because prices aren't going up. Because it's a finite system, and all you're doing is dedicating so much more to servicing debt that you can't afford the prices that increases that industry has to sustain to maintain margins of solubility in like escalation of its prices as the sum of debt is escalating. All they're doing is ensuring and exacerbating failure, at greater cost. There isn't even a single benefit of reducing price inflation, ostensibly preventing price inflation by increasing interest rates, which is the sole medium by which the Federal Reserve does this, you see. So the three cases which relate to fractional reserve, the first we covered already. A precious metal monetary standard cannot sustain relatively infinite, much greater increases in industrial production. The greater production and represented wealth can't be represented consistently with what former volumes of wealth were represented by the same circulation. So you have effective perpetual deflation, and this is always forced. As Benjamin Franklin even articulates in his early 1700 paper when he was just 23 years old, Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, he articulates this himself, that when they restricted the circulation to what gold and silver was in hand, they had only so much prosperity. But when they augmented this by issuances of paper currency, they prospered to a far greater degree. They don't even use the words inflation and deflation at the time. He merely speculates that there might be some amount of increasing the circulation, which would be too much, and others would be too little. But he doesn't answer the simple questions which can actually resolve the issue of how much volume of circulation you can and must have to resolve all of the objects of an economy. And then we can cover that as a separate thing. We can come back to it later. But the other thing that relates to this fractional reserve idea that you presented, and I agree. In the end, we can't implement a fractional reserve system, but the only need ever to implement a fractional reserve system relates, on the one hand, to a precious metal monetary standard, or any standard which would restrict the circulation to a relatively finite quantity or volume. Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that relates to a fractional reserve system is interest. Now, interest being as it requires us to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually reborrowing principal and interest that we pay out of the circulation as a subsequent sum of debt, which perpetually increases, therefore, by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. Being as this is the case, being as initially debts are collateralized, this fact that in the original financing of our production, or monetizing of our production, we are obligated to pay more out of circulation than exists into circulation and borrow that back as a new debt related to the same thing which has actually been consumed to some degree and in actual natural life is depreciated in value. And yet then we are exceeding the possibility of financing the perpetual multiplication of debt by legitimate collateralization of the same property which has already been fully collateralized into the prior sum of debt. So this, in effect, in conjunction with maladisposition, requires a perpetual increasing of the circulation to allow some new introductions which are only dedicated to a lesser sum of debt in relation to themselves, to be more free to help the rest of the circulation sustain its far more escalated obligations in proportion to itself. So it actually becomes necessary to try to extend the lifespan of this system, which can only still engender terminal failure to some degree by increasing what we circulate, But this is, in effect, a breaking of the rules of the system. From the very initial stages of monetization, because we have to violate collateralization, which in effect is to, being as we may increase the circulation, then we end up in all our deviousness violating this idea that there would be